Thanks, Becca. Thanks everyone for joining us. I am Katie C. I'm the tab lead here for EPA Region 3. So again, that's Technical Assistance to Brownfields Provider. And so we're based here at WVU in Morgantown. And then we have partners throughout a couple other universities on our tab team. But we're here today to provide you with some overview of what's coming. So Jared, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and then I'll move on.
Hi, I'm Jared Stewart. I'm one of the Community Development Associates with Mid-Atlantic Tab. Been here about 2 months now. Yeah, good to be here.
Thanks, Jared. All right, just a reminder, some of the ways we can help as your tab provider. Again, we provide assistance for all of EPA Region 3. One of the many types of resources we offer is education about brownfields and the process of it all. And so that includes webinars like today, trying to help you gear up for your grants. All right, at this time, I'd love it if our EPA friends and our Maryland State Agency friends could introduce themselves.
Since I'm in the upper left corner, I'll start. My name is Barb Krupiars. I am the Land Restoration Program Manager at Maryland Department of the Environment.
Hi. Hey everyone, I'm Sylvia Mosser. I'm with the Maryland Department of Planning, and I work closely with Barb and with Katie and other folks at Mid-Atlantic Tab and with our EPA Project Officer, Craig.
Yep. Good morning. My name's Craig Anderman. I'm a project officer in Region 3 for the EPA, and I'm also the lead liaison for the state of Maryland.
And I'm Dawn Farber. I'm also a Brownfields project officer for EPA Region 3. I'm also a little bit newer here, so I've been here a few months as well. And I'm just helping out today and learning more about the process all along with everyone else.
Thanks, everyone. So we want to take this time to let you know that today's webinar is intended to serve as a part 2 to a webinar that we hosted in August, which we considered part 1, because at that time it was giving a good overview of the types of EPA brownfield grants. And so this slide provides a link to that. If you didn't already watch the webinar, we encourage you to watch it so that you can get a little deeper information into a broad overview of the types of grants and how you could be preparing. And so if you did actually already review it, and if you need a refresher, you're welcome to take a look there, because both the slides and the recording of the webinar can be found there. So again, some of the content today is different because we're looking to highlight changes that have happened from last year to this year. That was information that was not yet available in August. And then it's a good opportunity for you to have the chance to hear more from your actual representatives for the state of Maryland. So there will be opportunities to ask questions. You can either ask them, as Becca said, in the chat, or we've included a couple of pauses in the actual webinar presentation to take the chance, or to take the opportunity to ask questions. Just a quick highlight of the agenda. We're going to go over the types of brownfield grants as well as who is eligible to apply, the importance of SAM.gov and application threshold criteria, changes to the grants from last year to this year, grant package, some information highlighted about what you can expect to include in your application, key information, and then just a highlight of resources and some upcoming information. All right, and I'm going to hand it over to Dawn now.
Thank you so much, Katie.
Sure.
So as the general overview, we have 4 different types of grants that people can apply for, although this year the multi-purpose grants are not included in this round. So it seems like every other year we'll have multi-purpose one year, and then we'll have the revolving loan funds the other year. So it's usually one or the other. They'll be referred to as MARC grants throughout the presentation, but this is what they stand for: the multi-purpose grants, the assessment grants, revolving loan fund grants, and cleanup grants. So as far as the grant timeline, obviously the request for applications is already out, and those are going to be due by November 14th to grants.gov. They have to be submitted through grants.gov I think in previous years, sometimes they would do different ways of submission, but right now we're making sure everything, excuse me, comes through grants.gov. Make sure your applications are complete, everything's correct before that deadline. Once all the applications have been received, then a threshold eligibility review will be completed in the December-January timeframe, just to make sure that the people who have applied are eligible for the grants they applied for and have met all the threshold criteria, which we'll discuss a little bit later. From February to March, a national review of the applications takes place. So we have representatives from all over the country reviewing the applications from EPA Brownfields, as well as a national federal partner from another organization or another district or section that will come in and assist with the review. It takes us a little while. We go through all of the applications in detail, as well as having an in-person meeting to review as a panel for a group of applications. So that's why it takes us a little while to get through. We try to do a really good job doing a detailed review. In April, the headquarters final review comes through and selection of applicants or recipients of the grants come through, and the announcements are made then in May for who has received the grants for the year. This table has a lot of information on it, but in general, this is what we anticipate as far as grant funds for the fiscal year 25. These are not necessarily the exact numbers. They may change slightly, but we have a pretty good idea of what we expect. As you can see, for the different types of grants, there may be different amounts that are available and a different number of estimated awards that will be given for each grant category. Also, we still have bill funding this year. So the bipartisan infrastructure law funds, what that means is there's no match requirement for any of the grant applications, which is nice. That will happen this year, and then the last year for the bill funds will be next year for the applications. As you see, we have different, also, if you'll look all the way to the right, where we're talking about new versus existing entities, that's an important designation that will depend on which categories that you are able to apply for. So in this case, new means you and you haven't received a grant that is closed after 2016. And then existing is that if you've had a grant that closed 2017 or later, you're considered an existing candidate. There are a few more awards available for existing candidates, but we also tend to have a larger pool of existing grantees that have done this previously. Also, if you'll note for the cleanup funds at the bottom, there are different numbers of awards and a different total for different types or different, I guess, ranges of values for your cleanups. So if you have a smaller cleanup that you think can be accomplished with $500,000, there are going to be 30 awards approximately given out in that range. Whereas if it's a larger cleanup, there are going to be fewer awards given for that larger dollar value. Related to eligibility for grants, certain organizations are eligible and certain organizations are not eligible. In general, eligible organizations include state, local, and tribal governments, general purpose units of local government, regional council or redevelopment agencies sanctioned by a state, nonprofit organizations with a couple of exceptions, and quasi-governmental agencies. Please note that if you're a nonprofit organization that's a 501c4, if you lobby to your Congress, you are not eligible for the Brownfields grants. If you're a 501c4 that doesn't lobby, you have to document that you don't lobby Congress, and then you may be eligible in that case. So this chart looks a little bit busy, but it can be really helpful to you. And it's specific for people who are existing grant recipients. So if you are a new applicant, then this will not apply to you. But if you have an existing grant, you are able to apply for another grant in some situations. Excuse me. But please note, like, for example, the community-wide assessment grant, if you already have one of those, you can also apply for another community-wide assessment grant, but in that case, you must draw down at least 70% of each assessment grant. So this is a helpful table if you're looking at applying for another grant when you already have one. There's a lot of flexibility to do that. Generally not one of the same type, but in some cases you can, as long as you've drawn down your funds. So if you have a grant and you're interested in applying for another, this is a really helpful chart for you. Also, if you're interested in submitting multiple applications for multiple types of grants, this is also a helpful chart for you. So you can apply for multiple grants in one cycle. What we don't want you to do is assume, though, like say you're applying for an assessment grant as well as a cleanup grant, that you assume that you will get both. If you need that assessment grant to get the information so that you can clean up a site, you probably want to just apply for the assessment grant this round. But if you have everything ready to go for a cleanup grant, you can obviously apply for both. You just can't assume that you will get both if that's necessary for your program. So again, also good guidance if you're interested in applying for multiple grants. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about SAM.gov. So this is really, really, really important. It's a website of the US government. There's no cost to use it. You can use it to register to do business with the US government, update or renew your registration, check the status of an entity registration, search for entity registration exclusion records. But to apply and set up your registration, it can take up to 2 weeks to complete. And this is going to be required for you to have your grant application come in. And we'll have a little bit more information about that. Also, I want to put in a tab tag here. So they are able to help with some of this if you have questions as you go through the process. So please reach out if you do have questions. You don't have to pay someone to help you to do this. So they can provide assistance as well. Okay, so as you know, the Notice of Funding Opportunities has been released. It was released through grants.gov. But again, all entities who apply are required to have an active SAM.gov registration. When you do this, you will get this unique entity ID, and that is something that you will have to have. And again, as we said previously, all of your applications must be submitted through grants.gov. Okay, so again, SAM.gov. So you will get assigned a unique entity ID the first time when you register. You will need to have your tax ID, some information about your bank routing number, your bank account number, and all non-federal entities must mail an original signed and notarized letter to the Federal Service Desk within 30 days of activation. So again, really important step. It can take some time to do, so please do that as soon as possible if you haven't already. Also, as a reminder, this must be renewed every 12 months and it must be active when you're applying for grants. And you want to keep it active throughout your grant process. Make sure any contact information is correct and up to date. We know that there can be changes in personnel and people helping to manage grants, and so we just want to make sure you have the most accurate information possible. When you register and put in your information, it's highly recommended that you use a telephone number that you use frequently and have easy access to. So in that case, it may be a cell phone number as opposed to your office number, because you may need that for authentication purposes. And so it'll be good to have that easily available and a phone number that you use often. Again, it's free to register and renew. Watch out for email scams. People will contact you and say you need to pay a fee to do things. That is not the case. So if you have questions, always let us know, but there is no charge for using SAM.gov. Okay, are there any questions about that? And did I miss anything, Katie, that you want to fill in for me?
You did a great job.
Okay,
You really
awesome. Just want to make sure everyone has the information that they need.
Absolutely. And we are not experts, but we're happy to help because it can be cumbersome to go through the SAM.gov process if you get stalled or have any issues. And so we can help you through that if you need.
That's one we ask everyone to do as soon as possible, just so we can make sure that's not a hurdle that you can't cross to get your application in. Okay, so next we'll talk about threshold criteria. As discussed earlier in the presentation, this is one of the first checks that we will do when grant applications come in. It's sort of a checklist of information that you need to provide and make sure that you're an eligible entity, and that we will go through before we go through a more detailed review. So all this information that's submitted for threshold criteria is used to make eligibility determinations. It lists out the threshold criteria pretty clearly, but you want to make sure that you provide that information. It is all correct. That is a really important part of this application, because again, if you don't meet the criteria, then your application will not move forward. So as it says here, again, I keep saying double check your work. We just want to make sure that everything's there, because you can't make changes once it's submitted. If for some reason there's a review done and you don't pass the eligibility criteria, or all the criteria are not included, then if you're ineligible for funding, you'll be notified within 15 calendar days of the ineligibility determination. So super important, make sure you check all of these boxes for us so that we can move your application forward. With regard to specific types of grants, there are multiple threshold criteria, but we want to make sure we want to cover a couple specific ones that we seem to have issues with on occasion. For assessment grants and cleanup grants, you need to have a current letter from your environmental state agency acknowledging that you're planning to do either apply for an assessment grant or a cleanup grant. You want to make sure that you give your state some warning before you submit these so that they have time to actually draft these letters for you. And you need to make sure that you have a new one each year. So for example, if you applied for an assessment grant last year and you weren't awarded that grant and you're applying again this year, you need to get a new letter from the state confirming that you're planning to conduct the assessment. For a cleanup grant, you need a little bit of additional information from the state. Information that says there's a sufficient level of site characterization from environmental site assessments performed, and a determination must be made by the state environmental agency that you do have sufficient characterization. You also have to have a phase 2 environmental site assessment completed for the property or an equivalent. Technically, if you're applying for multiple types of grants, so again, an assessment grant and a cleanup grant, only one letter is required, but you want to make sure that if that's the case, the state's providing enough information to cover both assessment and cleanup. You can also ask for 2 separate letters that can be a little bit cleaner, but as long as you have all of the information you need for both, you can use one letter. And again, you must include a copy of that letter with each of your applications. Or ownership eligibility specific to cleanup grants. The applicant must be the sole owner of the site at the time of application. And so a simple title will be attached to your application stating that you are the sole owner. And you must also have conducted all appropriate inquiries prior to acquiring the property. And so what that generally means is that there's no circle liability for you as the owner. That a phase 1 environmental site assessment has been completed not more than 180 days before the property transfer. And basically that can say, we know that there's potential contamination at this site, but you're not liable because you did that site assessment. So this is really, really important to make sure that that's done. So you're a sole owner, but you're also not liable under CERCLA for contamination at the site. Another important part for threshold criteria is related to community notification and public meetings for grants. So you have to have a public meeting where you discuss a grant application, you consider any comments that you get from the public, and this can be tied on to another regularly scheduled community meeting that's already on the books. So you can notify them, add yourself as an agenda item, and you can do it in person or virtually. Based on information gained from this public meeting, you have to attach specific information to your application confirming that you had that meeting. That includes the comments or a summary of public comments received, your response to the comments made by the public, meeting notes or a summary of the public meetings, as well as sign-in sheets or a participant list for who attended that meeting. In addition, you have to do community notification regarding your intent to apply for this grant. That needs to be an ad in a local newspaper or an equivalent means of communicating with the target community. So in this day and age with computers, you can do an email blast to the community. There are other ways to document it or do the ad in a local newspaper. That needs to come out no later than 2 weeks before the application is submitted. And this is the information below that must be included in that notification. And again, all of this then needs to be included that you did your community notification in your grant application. This is a fantastic infographic that was done to help us summarize some of this information. So this doesn't replace what's in the threshold criteria listed, but is a way to kind of help everyone understand some of the pieces a little bit more clearly. So for example, section A is talking about the property ownership eligibility and hazardous substances. And this is what we discussed already. Liable parties may include all current and former owners and operators and those who arrange for or contributed to disposal. I don't want to read all of it to you. And if you see that little link that says website, there is a link to the full handout here. But there can be exemptions to CERCLA liability, which you should be aware of. So if you do potentially have CERCLA liability, you have some opportunities, even if that's the case. So for example, if the property is publicly owned and was acquired prior to January 11th, 2002, then the CERCLA liability wouldn't take effect and you could still apply for a cleanup grant in this case. Let's see. And so there's other information about the exceptions to circle liability. And if you want to assert an affirmative defense for circle liability, again, publicly owned brownfields acquired prior to January 11th, 2002, there's some additional information needed. So if you follow the little dotted line in the arrow, you have to have some additional information if that's what you want to document related to circle liability. So this helps out a little bit with that circle liability question. If you didn't have the phase one, at least 180 days before acquiring the property, and there's a potential for that circle liability. In addition, there's some information about the property ownership eligibility for petroleum sites. So petroleum sites are a little bit different. And specifically, eligibility involves that there cannot be any viable responsible party for that cleanup. This is a little bit different. It tends to fall under RCRA instead of CERCLA. And the applicant cannot be potentially liable for cleaning up the site. So whoever's applying, if there was a chance you were responsible for that petroleum contamination, then you would not be eligible. So again, in this case, the petroleum site eligibility is decided by the state, and then the EPA can provide some support, and EPA also makes determination for tribes. But please look at the handout. That's really helpful to you to help understand these criteria more. And then for an assessment grant, also some information about applicant eligibility. So make sure you include your type and provide information that shows you're eligible. So when we're talking about eligible organizations, make sure you're clear on which organization you are and that you are one of the eligible organizations. And if you're a nonprofit, indicate if you are exempt from federal taxation. Again, same thing with community involvement for an assessment grant. You need to get the community involved, let them know you're applying for a grant, and let them know what you're intending to do regarding assessment in the community. Contractor information as well. If you do have a contractor already selected, you need to make sure that contractor was selected following the federal rules for selecting a contractor. That's important. So making sure you follow that process so you weren't showing favoritism and that you had a public request for qualifications for people who are interested. And then also, if you have a pre-existing brownfields grant, you must demonstrate that you have dispersed these funds properly before you are eligible for a new grant. Any questions about that? Or anything that I spoke about? Okay, otherwise,
so far.
well, great. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to put them in the chat, and otherwise I'm going to hand off to Craig.
Great. Thanks, Dawn. I appreciate it. I'm going to discuss the FY25 ARC grant changes. So just keep in mind that the FY25 multi-purpose grants are not included in the FY25 solicitation. I'm going to go through the assessment coalition grants first, and the changes are as follows. Non-lead coalition member that currently has an open grant or has an open grant within the last 7 years is now eligible to receive a grant. And at least one non-lead member of the coalition must have never been awarded brownfields grants. And then entities that have an open brownfield MARC grant are eligible to be a non-lead coalition member, but must demonstrate that they have drawn down 70% of the funding for each MARC grant. And lastly, the previous evaluation criterion included a note that if the coalition did not include at least one non-lead member that is a community-based organization, then the response would be evaluated less favorably. Next one is the revolving loan funds. Just because RLF grants were not offered last year, the language in the RLF grant guidance has been updated to reflect the changes that have already been made in the assessment and cleanup grant guidelines. Some of the changes are in sections on the climate and labor practices, and the substantial involvement section all have been updated. Refer to the RLF grant guidelines for more details. So for cleanup grants, there is a new option under the threshold criteria for applicants to demonstrate eligibility for a site with hazardous material that has not been released into the outdoor environment. And that is if the brownfield site has a hazardous substance contained in the building materials and the hazardous substance has not been released into the environment, then the liability may not apply. And the site is eligible for funding, provided all other site eligibility requirements are met. Next. Does anybody have any questions on that? So next, oh yeah, I'm going to pass it off to MDE to discuss the grant package.
Thanks, Greg. Hi, everybody. This is Sylvia Mosser with Maryland Department of Planning. I'm going to go through with you some information about the grant package, and I think Becca's going to share a link. I think she already did share it actually to the community-wide assessment grant solicitation. So if anybody wants to follow along, I'll tell you what page numbers I'm looking at. So for the narrative information sheet, it's on pages 22 through 25 of the solicitation. You'll see that this sheet is limited to 3 pages, single spaced. They do note that you should use your organization's official letterhead for this section, and that any pages over the limit will not be considered. So just keep it to the 3 pages. This section is not part of the ranking criteria. It's going to ask you for your identifying information, including your name and full address, the website URL for your organization, the type of funding that you're requesting, the location of the communities or community that you're proposing to serve with the grant, target area, and priority site information, which is for the site-specific assessment and cleanup grants only. And it does note here that if your target area is smaller than a city or a town, then they're going to ask you to list the 11-digit census tract number, and then they give you a resource for where you can find that information. If you're doing a priority site, you're going to provide the specific address for that site. And then I'm not sure if this is new this year, but they're giving you an option to include a map, which is limited to 1 page, to visually depict the target area and or the priority sites. And then that 1 page with the map will not count towards that 3-page limit. And then also, if you don't submit a map, that won't count against you. So you're good either way. If you'd like to include a map, you can. If not, then it's, yeah, you're not going to lose any points there. It's also going to ask you for some contact information for your project director or and the chief executive or highest ranking elected official. Population of your jurisdiction or the targeted areas, and then there's this other factors checklist. This section also includes the letter from the state environmental agency, which Barb from MDE is going to cover later. And then also just basically asking for authorization that or acknowledgement that EPA will be releasing copies of the application on their website. Like they'll be sharing certain information. So they're asking applicants to indicate any portions of the application that are confidential, privileged, or sensitive. Okay, and now I think that brings us to the end of the narrative information sheet. So we'll move on to the narrative, which is on that solicitation. It's pages 25 through 37. And this is the section that's really kind of your chance to make your project shine and stand out, in terms of, you know, why you think that this project is just worthy of being funded by EPA, and kind of get EPA interested in the project. So this is a 10-page limit, single spaced again. It includes responses to the ranking criteria, which are the project description and plan for revitalization, and then the community need and community engagement. Number 3 is the task descriptions, cost estimates, and then measuring progress. And then number 4 is the programmatic capability and past performance, which is where you show how your organization is basically capable of administering the grant if you are to be awarded the funds. Basically, EPA wants to be assured that your organization will be able to successfully spend the grant money in a way that meets EPA's requirements. And one of the ways here that they're asking you to assure them is to describe if and how your organization has successfully administered an EPA Brownfields grant, or if you haven't done that, then some other type of federal grant in the past. And I'm going to go through some of the other ranking criteria. We have the threshold criteria responses, which is part of the application submission checklist. And that addresses basically how your organization is eligible to apply for the grant and how you will go about informing and involving the community in the activities described in your application. You'll see through your application process that it's really important to EPA that you're involving the community in the project and engaging them and letting them know what's happening. And then also this section is going to ask how you're going to handle contractors and subrecipients if you do plan to name them before the grant is awarded. And then there's the other factors and considerations bullet here at the bottom is basically saying that EPA intends to select a minimum of 3 quality applications per EPA region. And they may consider these other factors that they identify in this list here, which is on pages 45 to 46 of that solicitation PDF. So it's important to describe if and how you meet those factors, including, let me just scroll down to that section. Some of them are basically if you have a population that's 15,000 or less, if the priority site is adjacent to a body of water, if it's in a federally designated floodplain, if your priority site would facilitate renewable energy, if the project will incorporate energy efficiency measures, and then there's also something about improving local climate adaptation or mitigation to protect residents and community investments. So those are just some things that are important to EPA. So if you can demonstrate that you meet, one or more of those factors, that's going to be beneficial toward your application. And then this note at the bottom is saying, kind of again, iterating that EPA will only evaluate the information that's requested and required. And so we don't encourage applicants to solicit support letters from members of Congress or include such letters with your applications, because it's going to be a little bit of a waste of your time since EPA won't be considering those. Okay, I think I'm done with this slide. We can move on to the next. I think now we're going to hear from Barb at MDE.
Here we go. Yeah, again, I'm Barb Kripyars with the Department of the Environment, and specifically talking about cleanup grants. There are several things that we are going to require and several things that we are going to request. So for a cleanup grant, you'll have to do your phase 1 environmental site assessment. There's been some concern or some misunderstanding in the past, because if you look at our MDE website with a policy document, it talks about a phase 1 having to be within 1 year. The confusion about that is we will accept it if it's been within 1 year, but you have to do the update per the ASTM standard. So you'll have to do the 4 or 5 elements that are required for an update. But otherwise, if it's been done in 6 months, you should be fine. And then we require either a phase 2 for a voluntary cleanup program or a work plan for a phase 2. But if you do the work plan, that will delay your timelines as well. If you're not eligible for our voluntary cleanup program, you won't be eligible for brownfields tax credits if your local community has enabling legislation to enable that. Not everyone has that in Maryland. And then the cleanup will be accomplished by EPA, but if Maryland would like to have a copy of the phase 1 and phase 2 that is done for that. It's not a requirement, but if you would share that, we would appreciate it. Next slide. The environmental review that we do, again, we request the assessment results when you are asking for a state letter of support for a cleanup grant. EPA does require it. You can send us a narrative otherwise that meets all the points in the requirements that EPA has. But if we can take a look at the assessment results, that would be helpful. I will note that you can send me the request for the letter of support, but I have had 2 other state of Maryland jobs. So if you send it to just Barbara Croupiers or Barbara Croupiers 1, it does not come to me. So make sure you have that all important 2 in the email address. And also we do ask that you send the request at least 2 weeks prior to the submittal. If you're running into a bind, we can do things a little bit more quickly, but the 2 weeks would be helpful. Also, let us know if you're eligible or ineligible to participate in our voluntary cleanup program. That's in our statute. If you have questions about that, just send me an email and we can work that out. If you're not eligible for the voluntary cleanup program, EPA again will make some determinations related to site characterization. And then as you go move forward with if you're awarded a cleanup grant, if you would keep us informed of your progress, we would also appreciate that. And then if you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to email or give us a call. So I just did a letter yesterday and sent it out today. So it took me, 1 day to do it. So it should be okay if you're doing things at the last minute. But so the one thing that, our letters will do it is acknowledge that we are aware of all of the points that EPA requires in the cleanup grant, and then our support related to that. We do have to have either, and maybe Dawn or Katie or Becca can make sure that I have this correct, because it was my understanding that you either have to have the phase 2, or you can have information that will ensure that the phase 2 will be completed by a slightly later date. I believe it was June in the following year. So please let me know if that's incorrect. And then again, one letter can be used for multiple applications, as was previously stated, and it has to be current. Again, here's my email address to send the request with the current status and any redevelopment plans if you have those already. And then again, 2 weeks notice, but if that's flexible, and any information that you can also provide to show the current site ownership, so we can take a look at what's been done in the history and compare it to your phase 1.
Thanks, Barbara. I'm going to go through some key information and some of the federal forms that we need to receive from applicants. So the first application form that we'll talk about is the SF424. And this is basically, provides the basic information to the government about your entity, and kind of acts like a cover sheet, if you will, for your application. Just remember, you should provide your legal entity's name, and it's the same one as the sam.gov website that you filled out, and then use the UEI as well from the sam.gov website too. Next is the budget information. Just remember that there is no cost share requirements for this round of applications, and not to separate out your funding requests from hazardous substances and petroleum funding like in previous years. And then we have your key contacts. For this form, just remember to use the same address as your sam.gov profile. I've had entities use different addresses, and we had to go back and fix the forms, so it can become problematic. For the pre-award compliance form, these forms all applicants need to complete, and it basically is checking the compliance with all federal non-discrimination regulations. For this form, please make sure that you answer every question. And then if you do not have an answer for a question, just put NA so the reviewer knows that it's not applicable. For the narrative sheet, just attach the narrative information, sheet, the narrative, and any required attachments as one file. And we can go to the next slide. So for grant debriefs, if you have applied in the past and haven't been successful, just use the grant debriefs to help you improve your application. And likewise, if for some reason you do not, or you're not successful in receiving a grant this year, we encourage you to ask for a debrief to help, improve for your next year's application. Next, this is just a reminder and a link to your frequently asked questions sheet. It's about 100 pages long, and it is a very helpful resource. The POs use it, and the potential applicants use it, and grantees use it all the time. So just remember that it's there. Next. Does anybody have any questions before we move on?
There is nothing in the chat right now, but feel free to drop those questions in, or if you're still typing a longer one, continue typing. Katie is going to get into some of our other resources provided by TAB. And before she runs into that, I'm also going to launch a poll that we need everybody to answer as part of our grant requirements. So that'll pop up on your screen if you've got the latest version of Zoom. First question is, how prepared do you feel to write an EPA Brownfields Grant application after receiving support and resources? And then the second question is optional. What other topics or activities would you like to see included in future TAB events? I'll leave that open for a minute, but Katie, feel free to keep going.
Thanks, Becca. Appreciate it. All right, so we just want to remind you how we can help if you need any assistance along the way. This is the information about how we can help all throughout the year, but for this particular time of year, we can help with grant writing assistance. We cannot write the grants, but we are available to help you with writing some sections or providing feedback, and we can also review your grants. So feel free to reach out to us and you can send it, and we'd be happy to be another set of eyes for you. And if you do choose to send something to us for us to review, we do ask that you submit it to us no later than November 1st to allow us ample time to be able to review it and give you good feedback. And a lot of times, if necessary, there's generally time to do a second review if that would be helpful. Just a reminder that, again, MDE is asking for requests for letters from Barb to be sent about 2 weeks before the actual deadline. And the big deadline is November 14th. So again, 2 weeks before November 14th for Barb's sake at MDE, and then again around November 1st for us. And I'm going to turn it over to Sylvia.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so we just wanted to take this opportunity to make a plug for our statewide Brownfields conference, which we plan in collaboration with MDE, and MDE has graciously offered to host us at their offices at Montgomery Park, which is a brownfield for those of you who came out last year and got to hear about the building's history. And so that's going to be Friday, November 15th, which is the day after your EPA Brownfield grant applications are due. So come out and celebrate getting those submitted with us at our conference. We really hope to see everybody there. And then I think the next slide, I was just going to go over a little bit how we can help with brownfields. This is actually a photo of one of the sites that we're assessing next under the community-wide assessment grant that we have from EPA. And this is in Western Baltimore. And we're really excited about this project. We're working with a kind of a grassroots community organizer who's trying to revitalize this neighborhood where he's lived for 40 years and grew up. And he works really closely with the community. So we're excited to be a part of this project. But we basically serve as a liaison mostly to help get you guys connected to these technical experts like Katie and Becca at TAB and Craig and Dawn at EPA and Barb at MDE. And then also just to help you think about what the resources are for your specific project needs. You know, oftentimes we talk with private developers who may not be able to access EPA funding maybe in the traditional sense. So we'll try to work with them to come up with creative ideas and solutions, and also, like always, are asking TAB for their brainstorming capabilities on projects like that. We also can help prepare grant applications, and then, like I said, access other types of funding that are out there. There are some other types of federal and state resources that we can help you do some research about and find out whether those might be a fit for you. Thanks, Katie.
Great. Thanks, Sylvia. All good things. All right. So just a reminder of how you can stay connected. We don't have Don's email. We need to make this update before we send it out, but it includes EPA contact information, Maryland Department of the Environment, as well as Sylvia at the Maryland Department of Planning. So again, our contact information is here as well for Mid-Atlantic TAB, all the ways that you can get in touch with us. And Becca will be emailing you following the webinar to provide a copy of the actual slides and a recording from the webinar. So if you also know of a friend who didn't get the chance to attend today, feel free to share that link with them, and we hope it will be helpful. So certainly if anyone has any other questions, we'd be happy to answer them at this time.